looking at questions that get asked quite often through the forums, emails, through the website that we've got, TorqueCars.com, and just looking at general comments that people make on YouTube videos, there seems to be a huge amount of myths and misunderstandings. Now, often these are areas which are confusing, and it's where you've used a sweeping statement to qualify something that doesn't apply in all cases. In this video, we're just going to tackle some common maintenance myths that I see people regurgitating time and time again, and just discuss some of the nuances behind that. First of these is oil change intervals. Some people say that you should change the oil every 3,000 miles, and others set another arbitrary amount of miles at, say, 6,000 or 9,000 miles, and they will passionately argue for that. Now, the reality is, it depends on you, how you drive the car. If you do a lot of short journeys and you were to send your oil off for analysis, you'd probably find that the oil has become diluted. There's a lot of moisture. There may even be fuel that has soaked through into the oil, and the oil has captured that. And because the short journeys are happening regularly, it's not getting a chance to burn these off. So if that's the situation, the oil protection is going to be compromised. So you would need to change the oil more frequently. As a general rule of thumb, most people agree that about 5,000 to 7,000 miles is when we should be changing our oil. There are long life oils. Manufacturers often say that these last for 24,000 miles, but there's certainly not going to be any damage done to your car by changing the oil more frequently. Your pocket may be damaged by that, but it's often better to err on the side of caution. But when you reduce the oil change interval down to, say, 3,000 miles, you're dealing with a law of diminishing returns. If you send the oil off for analysis at 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000, up to 7,000 or 8,000, you'll notice there's not a big difference in degradation between those mileages. So how much extra protection are you getting? Another thing related to oil is that you need to do an oil flush every time you do a change. So the oil flush goes into the car, you run the engine, and it loosens up all of the deposits, the varnishes, the gunk that has built up inside the oil. And when you drain the oil off, it contains more of these impurities. We only really need to do that if our car is subject to these build-ups. And most cars that are frequently serviced do not have this massive problem. So doing this engine flush every time you change the oil is irrelevant, really. You don't need to go to that trouble. Maybe do it every 3 or 4 years. But again, it's going to depend on your car, how you use it, and the general condition of the oil. So we can't make that sweeping statement that it's good to always do that, or that it makes no sense to ever do that, because it will vary. Another thing is that people wait for things to die or cause a problem before they're replaced. The car battery is one of the obvious things. Most people replace the battery when it's let them down. There are usually signs that that battery is on its way out, and you can avoid the inconvenience of a breakdown. It might mean you don't get to work that day. It might mean you have to pay for a costly recovery because you've broken down outside your town and you need to get the car recovered back home, and then you've got to take part of the day off work to get the battery sorted. Or you're just in a situation where you're forced to buy a battery from the nearest local place, and the cost of that can be about 50 to 60% more than if you had an opportunity to shop around beforehand. So it's certainly a false economy to wait for things to fail. Look out for signs that things are on their way out. Judge that by the typical life expectancy of the item. So with a battery, if your battery is about 5 to 7 years old, it's probably on its last legs. Do some tests, have a look at the voltage and how that's varying under load and when the car is standing. Make sure that you've got sufficient charge in the battery, because if you let that get too low, the battery degradation will happen more quickly. If it goes completely flat, a lot more damage is done, and it's very difficult to revive these completely flat batteries. You must always service your car at the dealership. Well, again, that's an expensive myth. People often felt that the warranty would be upheld only if you go to a main dealer, and that is just not the case. Various countries have now enacted laws that mean that any reputable garage, and by reputable that can vary from having a VAT registration status to having some form of qualification or reaching a certain standard as defined by the motor organisation governing body in that particular location. But as long as that happens, there's no reason for a warranty claim to be denied. And the idea that you get a better service from the main dealer is also a myth. I've seen some shocking things done by main dealers. They still are human, they make mistakes, they're often under a lot of pressure, and they often want to turn around these service items as quickly as possible to get the maximum number of cars going through. And often corners are cut. Tyres should only be replaced when they reach the legal minimum. So for many, that's 1.6 millimeters. Other countries have different levels. But think about the importance of your tyre. It's the only point of contact your car has with the road. And generally speaking, for most cars, at about 3 millimeters or less, the performance, the grip, the handling, the braking, everything you need your tyre to respond well in is compromised. You start to see a degradation at 3 millimeters. And if you're driving in wet conditions, we live in the UK, wet conditions seems to be about all we have, you would certainly come a cropper or have serious problems if your tread depth is starting to get down to the legal minimum. Don't delay that. Your safety, the handling and the performance of the car is vital, really, and just for the sake of replacing a tyre maybe 3 to 6 months early to replace it at 3 millimeters makes a lot of sense to my mind. Let me know in the comments what your thought is, what you tend to do when your tyres start running low and how often you check them. And while we're talking about tyres, we need to talk about tyre pressures. Should you check your tyre pressures when they're cold or when they're hot? Well, it's an interesting debate, and I've heard people make arguments for and against, but generally speaking, you check your tyre pressures when it's cold, when the car has not been running for long periods of time. Manufacturers have set the pressures in their recommendations, which is usually located on the little sticker somewhere around the car, for cold pressures. When you first get the tyre fitted, it's cold. That's the pressure that it's inflated to. So how much variation is there in tyre pressure according to temperature? Well, in the UK, we use Celsius. I know some other countries use this really weird temperature, Fahrenheit, but generally speaking, a 10-degree-Celsius drop will knock 1 psi off the pressure, and a 10-degree increase will add 1 psi in pressure. Obviously, there's going to be a fairly big variation between summer and winter. Do you only check your tyre pressures every 6 months? Because if you do, you're probably going to be seriously down in winter, or may even be overinflated in the summer. Going up to the maximum, there is still leeway set by the manufacturer for when the tyre warms up. That really is the optimum. When you drive the car cold, you still want the maximum amount of grip from the tyre, and that's going to be hampered if it is under or over inflated. So use the manufacturer's recommendations as a guide. Check the tyre pressures when they're cold. If you've been driving the car, assume that the tyre pressures are going to be higher than the cold reading, and if the manufacturer states you should inflate to 31 psi and you've been driving the car, maybe knock 2 or 3 psi off that when you do the tyre inflation, and then check it again at home when the tyre is cold. And checking tyres is something we should do fairly regularly. It should really be a weekly check. Don't rely on the tyre pressure monitor inside your car. They tend to react very, very slowly to fairly serious drops in pressure. Another thing is to warm your car up for several minutes before driving. Now, that in most cases is just not necessary unless you live in a very, very cold area and it's not physically possible to drive the car until you've got some heat inside the car and you've melted some of the ice that has built up on the outside of the car. Then we don't really need to do that. For most people, 30 seconds of idling is all that's needed, and getting out and driving the car really is the best way of warming up the engine. But we also need to change fluids in the car. The brake fluid, the transmission fluid, despite manufacturers' claims that it is a sealed for life thing, and power steering fluid, they do need to be changed periodically, but that period will depend very much on the condition of the car, how you use the car, and how much abuse these various fluids get. And by abuse, I'm generally speaking about the temperature variations. Most fluids start to degrade when they're subject to heating and cooling, and if that's quite severe, that can really degrade the fluid quite quickly. With brake fluid, you've got to watch out for water getting into it, which is something that does happen over a period of time. And also, levels tend to drop. Even in a sealed environment, you will lose some fluid somewhere. disappears magically. But don't ever assume that the levels are correct just because you're dealing with a sealed system. There's lots of things that can happen inside a transmission, inside an engine, and inside the power steering system itself that can leak off a little bit of fluid over a period of time. And if you see these fluid levels dropping, that's a sign to investigate further and find out what's going on. Don't get caught out. Don't fall for these common myths. I see a lot of YouTube channels starting up that are just regurgitating AI generated content. They tend to just use lots of library footage from various libraries out there to provide a distraction while the narrative is being read by an AI voice. And generally speaking, the standard of these videos is very low. They're giving very, very bad generic advice, or they're just plagiarizing the advice from other content creators and often overly summarizing it, missing out key details and important factors. We need to be careful where we get information from our cars. It's a safety thing, really. We want to make sure that the advice we're getting is not going to compromise the safety of our cars. So please do your research thoroughly. Don't rely on AI for the answers, and certainly don't rely on these many AI generated channels that are springing up that are regurgitating some of these really bad myths and misunderstandings that people have. Thanks for watching. If you found this video useful, please boot the like button. Please subscribe to the channel as well. That really does help us to get out there. And I've lined this video and this playlist up for you that you should find really interesting. Thanks for watching. See you in this next video.